Good morning, everyone. We're here this morning to resume the contract labor negotiations with the Boise Police Union. I'd like to start this meeting by going around and doing introductions. My name is Courtney Washburn. I'm the Chief of Staff for the City of Boise.
Jamie Sullivan, City Attorney.
Biff Jones, Chief Administrative Officer, Department of Finance Administration.
Damon Jones, Union. Kyle Wills, Union.
Danny Carter, Union.
AJ Veens, Union.
Kristen Holt, HR Benefits Administrator.
Christine Smith, Compensation Analyst.
Justin Erickson, Senior Budget Analyst, Department of Finance Administration.
Tammany Brooks, Boise Police Department.
Adam Collier, City's Outside Legal Counsel.
And with that, just a reminder to use your microphones. And I believe we're starting out this morning with a counter proposal from the union, unless I'm mistaken.
Yeah. So we wanted to start with addressing the city's proposal on wages. If you look at that first slide, it's a copy of the wage rates and the scale.
I'm sorry. What is it in the union's folder? or-
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
Did it not go? Okay.
And so for today's date, it's this folder. Okay, cool. I'm just clear.
We got it.
Okay. All right. So if you look at slide 2, it's basically a copy of the wage rate offered by the city. A couple of things we wanted to point out is, given the way the city wants to, if we go down to slide 3, or the way the city wants to convert laterals, that pay rate proposed would cause a LPO 3 to take a pay cut by $1.30 an hour. It would cause a LPO 5 to take a pay cut by 8 cents an hour. Would be an 82 cents pay raise for LPO 7s and a $1.95 pay raise for LPO 10s. If we just cap our current LPO rate and offered by the city was 5% for year 1, that would mean our LPO 3s, we left everything the same and took 5%, would make $3 more than what the city proposed. Their LPO 5s would make $2 more than the city would propose. LPO 7s would make $1.23 more, and LPO 10s would make an additional 18 cents. We want to highlight that the proposal from the city tops out pay for up and coming members throughout the years to step J, which is a lower top end rate than officers potentially could make currently by $3.37. So, this pay proposal, I know that City Finance did a lot of hard work crunching numbers. We appreciate that. But I think there is a big misunderstanding on the LPOs. They only took into consideration the NPO pay grades. And there's no way our membership is going to take a reduction in pay given current cost of living and inflation rates. And so the union is going to reject the city's proposal for pay. Would like to have a conversation with the finance people real quick and get a better understanding of some of the numbers that you guys crunched. Specifically, when you came up with wage rates and the dollar figures and percentages, how many full-time employees did you calculate in that? I want to make sure that we're not misunderstanding the number of personnel involved in that. So maybe we could explain that a little bit for me, Biff.
And then just to be sure I'm tracking your question, are you asking when we calculated your proposals or when we're calculating the city's proposals?
When you calculated our numbers and came up with the figures that what it would cost the city for those figures.
Yeah, so as we discussed last time, there's two primary methods at play. One, when we leverage Questica, we're taking all of the authorized police positions and we're applying the rates and the changes to all of the authorized positions. So vacant or currently occupied, all of the positions would be calculated because we're doing a 10-year forecast.
Okay, so for example, 311 full-time employees is what I think they are currently slated for. Is that the number that we used?
Justin, do you recall, is it 311?
I'll confirm that.
Okay,
Yeah, because our concern is 311 is the department's full-time employee rates, which includes all sworn, which is not all union members. That includes the executive staff, management of about 20 officers. So if we're using the 311 number, that's going to skew those numbers. If we're using the actual sergeant and officer sworn numbers, that's going to be the most accurate. So I want to make sure that we're all on the same page.
perfect. Yeah, great question. And I know in the systems, sorry, as Justin looks that up. So we have every position is designated properly, so we will have applied, benefit by benefit. We will have done our best to apply to the right positions.
Yeah, I mean, I think I understand the methodology and the Questica, how the software works and how you guys are calculating it. My concern is that there might be errors in not the formulas or the program itself, but applying the proper amount of numbers. In other words, if we have 100 sworn officers and 50 sergeants and 20 lieutenants, are you applying the 170 versus the 150, et cetera?
Mhm.
And then additionally, the vacant positions, how are we calculating those?
Yeah, so vacant positions factor in just like any other position. The city applies what's called a vacancy rate factor as well. And so based on historical vacancy, and this is consistent with our budget development philosophy. So based on historical vacancy rates, then that vacancy rate is applied in any particular year. And we could look up what is the vacancy rate for the police department if that's interesting to you.
I just, like I said, we were very lateral heavy.
Uh-huh.
So, and I don't know how the department, they've lowered the standards as far as hiring practices go, or the requirements, I should say, not necessarily the standards. So I want to make sure that it's reflective. Additionally, maybe Justin would look into this on the incentive pays. I would be curious to find out the numbers that were used to calculate how many people were in certain positions, et cetera. And I just want to make sure that we're given an accurate number so that we're close on those figures.
I know on that subject specifically, we reached out to the police administrative staff and we got a spreadsheet from Jody McCroskey. And then we applied, based on her input, those incentives to the individuals that she said would qualify.
And perhaps maybe a forwarded copy of those positions would be
Sure. Yeah, happy to provide that.
Beneficial. When we asked for specific numbers of employees previously, we were denied that information. So it makes it harder on our side to calculate those figures.
And so just to put a bow on that request, so I'm hearing that you'd like to see which positions qualified for the different incentive pays as we costed those out. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay.
Plus, I think it'll help us on future calculations and trying to come to some common factors if we understand that where the city's numbers are coming from specifically on those incentive pays and other items of the like. I dropped in another presentation. I wanted to have a conversation related to, whoops, make sure I dropped in the right one here. Yeah. The officer per thousand ratios to give the city some perspective of the challenges of our membership on a day-to-day basis. And so these numbers are taken from the 2019 UCR report by the FBI. They are the most current ones. They break it into two groups. Well, they break it into multiple groups, but two relevant groups for us, 250,000 population and above, and 100 to 249,000 population. And those are both categorized as group 1 and group 2. So the national average in group 1 is 2.6 officers per thousand. The average for group 2 is 1.6 per thousand. Depending on growth figures and population estimates, we're right there on that bubble, somewhere between 235 from the 2020 census and pushing up to 246. If you look at some of the UN population estimates and some of the real estate estimates. So in the Western region, mountain region, the average is 1.8 per thousand. Again, group 1 is 1.7 and group 2 is 1.5. You go down to the next slide. The city provided us some comparison cities.
Can I just ask a quick question?
Yeah.
This has been a point of confusion. When this refers to Western region, what does that mean? Is that the Intermountain West or?
Yeah, so the FBI has it broken down into 4 regions. And in those 4 regions, they have subregions. They have Pacific Coast, they have Mountain Region, and there's a few other regions that they break each region into. So it's subregions. So the Mountain Region is applicable. If you look at their map, it's applicable to where Boise is located. The Idaho state average of 1.7 officers is taken off the Kootenai County webpage, but that's based on 2017 statistics from the UCR. So the same location, but 2017, and they break down the whole state and surrounding areas to include Spokane Valley, et cetera, some of the Eastern Washington locations. And so when you look at the comparison cities provided by the city, Salt Lake has a 2.3 officers per thousand ratio. Anchorage has a 1.8 officers per thousand ratio. Tacoma is 1.7. Coeur d'Alene, Idaho is 1.7. Idaho Falls is 1.5. Nampa is 1.5. Reno is 1.4. And Boise is 1.2 officers per thousand. So what that really means is our officers are having the burden of work. It's providing them less proactive time. It's a stress on the mental wellness of our members. And it really reflects on our service capabilities to our citizens. So if you go to the following slide, you can kind of see.
Before we move on, I do have a question. Is the
Sure.
1.2 officers, I'm still on slide 3, is that reflective of the vacancies, or is that what the ratio would be if you all were fully staffed?
That's the ratio for fully staffed.
Okay.
That's based on a 311 full-time employees
Thank you.
ratio. And so there's a graph on page 4 that shows where we are nationally in the region and with those comparison cities. Meridian is not located on there. We had a hard time finding. They are growing fast. And so we were unable to get solid statistics on their ratios. So some of these numbers are based on population. If you go with the World Population Review.com numbers, that they're estimating that population for Boise City to be 241,000 and some change, with 620 in the metropolitan area. If you look at some of the real estate information like Compass, their census is saying, the census from 2020 saying there's about 761,000 people in the metropolitan area of Boise, which is an additional factor in that many people come here both for entertainment, for business. So our non-resident population obviously swells past our resident population, and those people still need to be served, and those people still have demands on police service. So we're having a substantial burden of workload, which cuts out our proactive patrolling and policing, and it's causing delays in customer service to our citizens. And so we want to make sure that the city understands these things as we ask for our wage compensations and some of our benefits.
If I could just add some items in this space. I think the union is aware that the city council has commissioned a study on staffing for both police and fire. The expectation of that information would be an increase in sworn police officers. They were charged with taking into consideration the city's growth in addition to the need for officers to spend more time with the community. I think the challenge I'm having representing the city is we share a desire to expand the police force, but with budget constraints, it is unclear to me if the priority is on additional officers or using those resources to compensate the ones we have. We've talked about this balance before, but the balance of expanding the police force, which the council intends on doing after the staffing study is conducted, with a limited amount of resources, we're just trying to figure out where best to place that money. So I'm interested in the union's position on the need to grow the police force versus using the available money on the current officers we have. Because the city's approach is very similar to some of your comments. We understand the workload. The remedy, I think, in terms of the council's perspective, is the expansion of the force, which we can't do if we give you all the money we have.
I appreciate that perspective, Chief Washburn. And I think that there's a balance that needs to be had for sure. What I fear is what Boise is starting to become and is trending to become is a place for officers to come and get experience and for us to spend our money training them and then to leave and go to other cities. And then we're spinning our wheels, wasting hundreds of thousands of dollars on officers who then just take those experiences and apply them to the other citizens in other communities. And we have been the benefit of that in the past due to our increased wage compensation and benefit packages in comparison to other agencies in the Treasure Valley. And I think that has paid well for us when we can exploit those officers who want to come to work for us and use all of their experience and training to make good police officers and help the citizens of Boise. So I think it's a tough line, and I know what the department's position is. They believe that we would rather have more officers than higher pay, but right now we're extremely overworked. We see the city going in the wrong direction, crime-wise, and our ability to prevent that. And I think that the goal is to have good quality employees who have a high level of service, who have a high level of intelligence, and who care about their community. That coupled with the community that cares is going to make for a good city for public safety. And we've had that in the past. Some of that is slipping away. And I know that the city has constraints financially. And we feel like there needs to be at least some solid wage compensation and some solid growth. In the last 10 years, the city has done, which is outside of the purview of this administration, 2 staffing studies, one through Northwestern University. And that one at the time, about approximately 7 years ago, said we needed 70 more officers on the street and several more sergeants plus detectives. And it went through a 4-year progression, which led us to about 100 more officers than we currently had at the time. Now we have grown some, probably about 20 or 30 officers since that period of time, but it still leaves us short.
Just so
that.
I'm clear, I think the policy that was inherited by this administration was some, and I'm not super clear on the details here, but some negotiation was had that the city would add 5 patrol officers every year in regards to that staffing study. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. And like
And
I said,
that, just so I'm clear, was vastly less than what that staffing study recommended, correct?
that is correct.
Okay.
And the city did add positions.
A quick question for the city. So just so I understand, there are no additional positions funded in FY 23 on the city's budget for police. Is that for sworn officers? Is that correct?
The, with an amendment. So the vacancy rate within the police department was such that even if we added more FTEs, we thought we were unable to fill those vacancies. So we're focused on filling, I think it's 30, I'm close, the 30 vacancies we currently have in sworn officers. And then in response to the staffing study for council is interested in doing an interim budget change associated with the information that comes back for both police and fire. But we heard the union and the officers in the need to fill the vacancies we currently have. Adding more empty FTEs actually doesn't help anyone with workload issues. So we're hopeful in terms of timing that we can fill the vacancies we currently have. And then with the staffing study information, look at what the city can add in the upcoming fiscal year.
Perfect. So in this contract, the next 2 years, which would be FY 23 and FY 24, there'd be very few additional positions added. Is that fair to say?
I don't know. The nature of the staffing study was specifically to look at a community policing model where the city from the past has just been looking at response times. So I think the city is being very intentional to try to address the workload issues. It's my understanding that the workload issues are the primary challenge facing the department. And so once we get those filled and we get the staffing study information back, we'll have a better understanding of where the city should invest its money next.
Perfect. So just to answer your question from earlier then, Chief, as far as where the city's looking at putting money, over the life of this contract, really, there wouldn't be additional positions to put that money to, on top of the fact that it would typically for an officer to go through advanced academy, FTO, and actually be out on the street would be nearly a year. So even if those folks were identified and hired today, we'd be FY 24 before we have additional bodies in the budget needed. So that's kind of where the union stands when you ask, do we want kind of money to our officers or money to additional? We don't see during the life of this contract a way that there's going to be a space to add additional FTEs to the city's budget. So
That's helpful. I appreciate that.
Hey, Denny, can I ask a couple questions?
Please.
I'm looking at the officer ratio, slide 3, in which you have the ratio of officers per 1,000 for the comparable cities. I know you said you received the information regarding the population from, was that the World Population Review? Is that correct?
That is one of the population sources that we looked at.
Okay, so specifically as it relates to that chart right there, one, I just wanted to know where you got the population numbers from, and then 2, where you looked at and received the information regarding the current staffing levels of each of those comparable cities.
So the comparable city staffing numbers come from the UCR, from the FBI. They come from the 2019 statistics from those cities. The only thing that is a little bit is we're guessing on the population for the city of Boise. But if you go with the 2020 census numbers of 230 something, it bumps that 1.2 to some 1.2 and loose change. If you go with the 241, it lowers the 1.2 with some change, but it doesn't come really off of the 1.2 number. It just pushes it between 1.2 and 1.29-ish. So depending on the current population estimates, that's where that number comes from, based on the 311 FTEs.
Got it. So you're looking at 2019 police department staffing numbers on 2022 population numbers for those other comparable cities?
Yeah, that is the most current available information from the FBI's UCR. So just like with the economic stuff, there's a big curve, and third quarter of last year was what we were basing the economic numbers from. It's the same with this. There's a big curve, as you well know.
And then was there any consideration given to the crime rates and call volumes of those cities versus Boise?
Those are the cities chosen by the city as comparable cities. So I guess the question would fall back on y'all, what information you use to make those comparison cities. But I thought that it was relevant, since the city thinks that those are relevant entities to look at for compensation. So we have a different position and feel like we have to outpace local agencies to keep our officers. We have to be able to outpace local agencies to recruit laterals and to hire quality people. There's some differences of opinion on that, obviously. And the department's position is, if we lower requirements, that we should be able to increase the fill rates. But I think it's more related to, the correlation is more related to pay than the department is willing to admit. So I put in another presentation related to tax dollars being spent on public safety. Pull it up. So we went back to 2014, the numbers that were provided by the city's public budgets. And in 2014 and 15, 64.9 cents out of every dollar was spent on public safety, to include police and fire. Then we went to 2016, and 32 cents of every taxpayer's dollar was spent on public safety for police. That continued in 17 and 18. And then in 19, it started to decline to 31.8 cents. Bounced back up a little bit and to 31.9 and 20. And then in 21, it dropped to 28.8 cents of every tax dollar, and has dropped to 26.9 for fiscal year 22. If you go down to the graph, you can see that the money of taxpayer money being spent on public safety for police is declining in the last 8 years. If you go to the next slide, you'll see a comparison between revenue expenditures from the city and police. And you can see that, yes, the city has invested more money in the budget for the police department, but the ratio of growth, trend growth, is not the same. And I think that's prior administrations from the city primarily. However, I think it's important that the taxpayers know that less of their dollar is going towards public safety as crime and growth increase in the city at substantial rates. And I think that is a concern of our members. And I think it's a concern that the citizens should have.
Just a clarification, I think these numbers show the city's allocations from the federal government. Those grants and the recipient of those funds were limited. So I'm wondering if you've included the funding we got associated with COVID relief, the funding associated with ARPA, and other federal programs in which public safety was not considered a recipient for those. Your timing, just generally, when this decline is on, I don't know which slide this is, for every tax dollar with the chart, seems to correspond to the city receiving large federal grants.
So in 14 and 15, the city, we can only go off a city budget publicly public information.
Did,
Um,
but which revenues did you pull from? Was it property tax or was it all city revenue?
So these are from the city's budget. These pie charts are from the city's published budget for every year. These are not pie charts that we created. These are pie charts that we took from the actual city budget, the published city budget, annual city budgets. And I'm not really sure if they included any kind of federal granting funds or not. This was the public information of where citizens' tax dollars go. And so I could understand that there was some COVID relief money. It's not clear to the union where that money went, and it possibly could have gone in our direction. However, it's just showing a 8-year trend. And I can't speak to why there was a decline starting in 2015 and kind of slowly trending down, specifically related to, if you look at the 16 total expenditures and total revenues for the city, you can see that increase is greater for the city than it is for the police department. It does show an increase for the police department, but if you look at that trending line, it's at a steeper rate of climb. And so I think it is somewhat relevant for people to understand where their tax dollar is going. So I don't know if
I can't tell from this information. So I don't know what happened in 2015. You all are in a better position of understanding that. I just question which revenues these are. And I'm sure these pie charts are public information, but I'm missing the asterisk that explains what revenue this is based off of. It's just, I'd like the opportunity to go through these numbers and make sure we're talking about the same thing. The other, did you lump in public safety as a whole, or did you pull out police and fire in your analysis?
so. This analysis, are you talking about on the pie chart or are you talking about on the graph?
Well, if the pie charts are ours, then I'm talking about the graph. What I'm trying to get at is, has the city, and I don't know the answer to this, maintained investment in public safety and given more to fire than police? Or what's the relationship between the two public safety entities from your perspective?
I think there was a period of time where the increases occurring to the fire department were different than the increases coming to the police department. I think that from our perspective did occur to some degree. I can't speak to the nature of their needs, whether they needed more money than we needed, et cetera, on a percentage wise. I just find this interesting, and I think that the city's in the best position to kind of delve into these numbers a little more than us, since they're the ones that generated them. But I think as a general citizen, when you look at it, I want to make sure that, we're still a priority, especially in today's time. And I think that it's fair that, safety should be a high priority for the citizens, and that their tax dollars should represent that. And I know we're an expensive department and entity to run for the city. We're a large department as far as the city goes. We run 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. And so those operating costs come at a high price. And I understand that we're expensive. I think the citizens support the police department. I think the citizens have a good relationship with our members in our police department. And I think that comes at a cost to some degree. And I think it's something that our citizens still care about and want moving forward.
So just a quick question. Would you like us to take a look at these numbers and make sure we're talking apples to apples? Or did you provide this information to just demonstrate that you would like to see a different trend associated with police investment?
I think a little bit of both. I would welcome the city
Okay.
to get in
I
there.
just don't want to leave, if we find inaccuracies with this information, I don't want the public to be confused about the city's investment in the police department. So we can go back and look at those numbers, but generally, I just want to make sure I understand the intent of this information. Would it be fair to say that the union is concerned that the trend is not to increase investment in the police department, and you believe these numbers show that? I'm just trying to get to the final chapter so I understand the information we're looking at.
Yes, I think that's a fair assessment to say that the union has concerns of the investment from the city. And I do want to make sure that we're comparing apples to apples.
Okay.
And I don't want to be unfair to the city related to COVIDs and grants and all those kinds of things. And we can do a little bit of research on that too. But I think if the finance people could go into that, that'd be
sure.
great.
Thank you.
And just so you're aware, these pie charts came from the city's website under the property tax analysis section of the website. So
Thank
we're
you.
assuming
That's
that
helpful.
property tax-
I mean, it'd be nice if the city only had 2 pie charts, but there are many pie charts. And without the caveats and the notes and the asterisks, it's hard for me to tell which pie charts we're looking at. But we can have our folks go back so that I can understand if we're talking about the same thing. And that if the trend has been headed in a certain direction, what conclusions the city might draw from that, depending on the nature of the information.
I appreciate that.
Can I just make a quick comment? I'm just looking at the last slide, the one that shows the police expenditures per year from 2016 to 2023. And when I look at that, it appears the last 2 years, the police expenditures have gone up $7 million each year, whereas the previous years it was anywhere from 2 to 4 million. And so to me, this reflects that the city has made a significant contribution to police the last couple of years. Am I missing something?
Well, I think our concern is that the revenue growth comparison to the police department growth, that the priority of the city, they may be placing their priorities in different locations with their financial obligations. And so we're not arguing that the budgets haven't increased, and we're not arguing that the budgets haven't increased over the last 2 years. I think what we're trying to point out is that the city's revenue and budget has expanded at a certain level, and we want to make sure that we're being considered as a priority in that expenditure.
So with the $7 million investment, do you feel as if that's not adequate, the city's investment in the department?
Well, I think that it's always tough. The staffing is the issue, right? And the population growth, I mean, how many people are going to come here next year? It's hard to say. We can trend it, et cetera.
I was going to say, I have a department who can answer that for you.
So, that's, and of that, how much is that going to increase crime, and how many calls for service is that going to increase? And those are always tough to quantify, and we're always trying to come up with that. And so I think that we fell behind the curve on the amount of officers we should have working here. And there were some lean times, specifically back in the early 2010, 11, 12, and 13 for the city, where the union took no pay raises and at the behest of the city's budget, and are willing to work earnestly with the city. But we want to know that the city's growth has expounded substantially, as everybody knows. And with that, we want to make sure we're keeping pace with that for our members. And I know the department has similar goals, but they have a different perspective from the management side related to how that money should be spent and what are appropriate. And so we're representing the guys that are handling calls every day, people that are coming out in the middle of the night to solve major crimes. And so we just want to make sure that we're keeping trend on that, and we're keeping an eye on that, and that the citizens are aware of it, and that the city is aware of it, and that we're being treated appropriately. So we're not saying that the last 2 years have been a poor, we just want to make sure that we're trending with the city's growth.
And I think, Adam, we're talking about two different things. You're talking dollar amount of our budget increase. What we're saying is the percentage of the increase that the city's revenues have is a greater percentage than our police budget has increased, if that makes sense. So yes, the budget has gone up, but the city's revenue budget has gone up by a greater amount than that.
Right. Yes. Okay.
I dropped in the wage counter proposal. I think this is going to require some digging into, so to speak, specifically related to conversion to the new pay format. Like I mentioned earlier, the LPOs, et cetera. We really have to have a conversation about this and trying to figure out and get this squared away. What we're asking for, essentially, if you go down to the bottom, the last page is 8% in year one, a 6% in year two, a post-certificate pay of 1% for intermediate, 2% for advanced, 3% for master in a non-compounding fashion, 4% incentive for detective pay, 2% for wearing body camera for patrol and COD, the same sick leave information and same detective on-call pay. And if you go back up as a quick summary, because I know you guys are going to have to do your calculations and look at these things. I really want to talk about, we've expanded this pay scale from A to J in a different way than the city has done it. We're asking that the city start its officers off with a non-certified pay rate, and then step A would be after they're certified. That would give the city a little more room financially. And additionally, we asked that we go from 8 years to 10 years and 10 years to 12 years. So the maximum time would be 12 years to reach top pay. That allows a conversion of police officer 15s and police officer 20s, a place to go without compressing it and costing more money as previous scales. And so the biggest thing is we want to have a conversation about the lateral pay. And so as you look at that, we want to bring the lateral pay in at step Edward, and we want to for LPO zeros, and then we want the LPO threes to start at step G as in George, and the sevens to start at H, which would be pretty much where they are now, and tens would start at step I, which is pretty much where they're at now. And so it would be a change when we converted these pays from 3 scales to 1. The LPOs were left behind under the city's proposal. However, we want to make sure that we kind of figure this out now. And you'll notice in here that there is no corporal. The union is no longer interested in having corporal as a supervisory rank. We think that it's a way to save money, and we'd rather have money in our members' pockets. And we were trying to help the department out with that concept, but I think the cost of it are something our membership is uninterested in currently. And so there is no corporal in this system. If you go down to page 2 or the page 3, I guess it is, you'll see the sergeant's pay grades, and you'll notice that they are pretty close to, we put them in reverse order, but they're pretty close to what the city's proposal was for year 1. They're not very far off, a little bit more off on year 2. And so you would start as a sergeant, you'd have 4 pay grades instead of 5. And basically you took those 4 current pay grades and added 8% to it. So currently with our LPOs, we've battled back and forth on this a little bit already. We have a system that is unfair and biased when it comes to bringing in laterals, not because of ill intent from the management, but just because anytime you have a system that is based on subjectivity, you're going to have biases. And so we have officers that were brought in at LPO 10 from an organization, And then we had officers who had more experience than them come from the same organization and be brought in at LPO 3. And so we're struggling to understand the quantification of that. And we basically defer to our previous proposal related to how we would bring in future laterals. But this pay would help ease some of the pains of those biases that have occurred in the last 2 years. I'll give you an example. We had an officer come here from an organization. The following year, an officer with less experience than him from that same organization was brought in at a higher pay rate. And so very frustrating for that member that he's making less money. If he would have just not come here a year earlier, he would be making more money today than he was then. So with this proposal, as far as the conversion goes, that's going to clean up a lot of the LPO issues. And so once again, we took out step 9 and went from 8 to 10. And we took out there's no step 11. This just goes from 10 years to 12 years. And I'd be happy to entertain any questions.
On the slide 4 on the wage counter proposal, do you perceive this as an encapsulation of all the economic proposals we've had thus far? Like, is this an entire list of what the union would like to see, or are we missing other items? Just so I'm tracking all the pieces.
So on the final page, it kind of has a summary. We have whittled it down to this. We still want to add member contribution to the PEHP, but that's not at a cost to the city minus the administrative side of that. So in an effort to, we were pretty far off between our first proposal and your first counter proposal. So we felt like we made reasonable, aggressive steps to try to get closer. We can rely on Biff and his team to actually give us those numbers. But, essentially the way Biff's team had calculated it, no offense, Kristen, it was 13.3% and 7.7%. And so we're asking for 8 and 6 plus incentives.
I appreciate that. Back to laterals, so that in order for me not to get lost in the numbers, what is it? Is it equity? Is it consistency? What is the union's goal associated with laterals? We obviously need them, right, to fill the vacancies of the police force, but I'm a bit lost in the numbers. So it's easier for me to understand the goal of the union in the lateral space.
So I think it's critical on the recruiting side. And I do think that Boise is a unique organization in that we probably have somewhere between 50 and 60% of our members that were lateral, some of them from the state of Idaho, some of them from other states. And I think we gleaned a lot of experience and diversity related to that. And I think that it's important to carry that on, as well as generate new blood, because we're constantly, that diversity breeds good culture and good ideas. So currently, the chief at his discretion can bring people in up to LPO 10. And based on what he thinks is applicable based on their experience. The problem with that is it's very subjective. And so when you have a member come from the same organization who's making less than a member who came from that same organization, it causes a lot of internal strife and it causes problems. And so we want to remove the ability of the chief to do that. And we basically just want to bring them in a consistent fashion where it doesn't matter what organization you come from. If you have this much experience, you can be brought in this range. So our first proposal had a 1 to 3, 3 to 5, a 5, and a +8. So they could be given credit for 8 or more years of service at that rate. They could be given credit for 5 or more between 5 and 7. And so we're really trying to create a system that is equitable and non-biased. And so taking the subjectivity away from management and putting it into a a formula or a standard pay grade step. I think it also will help on the recruitment side because laterals will know what their pay would be if they decided to come here. And as they're in that process, what it would come here. I recently talked to several members who came here last year, and they said there was like 25 emails back between them and HR trying to figure out where the pay is. And there's so much confusion on this pay because of these pay grades. So we want to create equity. We want to make a system that is unbiased, and we want people to be able to transparently understand where they would come in pay-wise based on their current experience. And so with our new scale, because the original numbers are based on NPOs, and there's different levels. LPO pay is different than NPO pay, and so there's some nuances to it. For example, like an LPO 3 is going to make more money than an NPO 3. And so I can't just take a percentage and add it to pay grade 3 because that's an inequitable thing. So what we'd like to do is convert them in this rate and that's why we put it on here. So LPO 0s would come in at this, be converted at this rate. LPO 3s would be converted at this rate. 5s would be converted at this rate, and 10s would be converted at this rate. We don't have any current 15s or 20s, but we do have it listed on this new pay scale. And then from there, starting going forward, it would be that system where it's apparent and open and transparent. I don't know if that answered your question or not.
Well, what I'm struggling with is removing the discretion from the chief. At the end of the day, we pay the chief for his discretion, so you can't remove entirely his discretion. I'm just wondering the judgment behind removing the discretion versus letting a formula decide the quality of someone's experience coming into the department. Like, have you had any discussions about that balance? Because sometimes you get what you ask for and then you don't like it in the end.
That is
I'm
correct.
just trying to understand that.
So when you hire a new police officer, it's always a risk. You try to hire good people, you try to train them, you screen them. They're going to be a good employee or they're not, just like any other business. That holds true with people that come from other city entities. If you've got a parks person that came from another city, we're trying to figure out how good of a person they are. They do have experience in that relevance. They may be a good employee. They may not be a good employee. The problem is most agencies have it standardized. It's not completely subjective. So originally we proposed a half credit kind of thing. That was denied by the department and the city. So then we asked for a system that is equivalent to Meridian PDs because we are competing with them for these recruits at laterals. And so if a lateral is going to get the same level of experience as the Meridian system, that is a factor that should not come into play. Because if I'm looking, I'm an 8-year officer from somewhere else, I'm going to start at the same level as Meridian as I do in Boise. It comes down to pay and benefits and some of the working conditions. So that removes it on the ability to attract laterals. So it's not that there wouldn't be any discretion for the chief. There is some in that system that we proposed. If you can be brought in at different levels depending on your experience, but it is pretty hard to quantify what the police department is in an area and what kind of work they do. If you just look generally here, what officers do in Garden City, what they do in Ada County, what they do in Meridian, you can't just go off of size of agency. Ada County is a much larger agency than Garden City, but Garden City has a lot of crime and a lot of work, and their officers are very busy and they gain a lot of experience. So how do you look from afar and say, well, this is a 300-man organization, this is a 40, I'm just making up numbers, but 40-man operation, which one has more experience? And I think that's pretty challenging to do. And then you look at the education side, and then it becomes unequitable for new officers who may have those kinds of education and certifications that they're being not paid for, but laterals are being given increased credit for. So it's a problem. Obviously, we're willing to work with the department on coming up with that, but we need to come up with a system going forward that is equitable, that eliminates as best as possible the biases, that is competitive with the local agencies, so that we're not bringing in people lower than they are, and that can help dissuade them from coming here. And then additionally, with the compression, the changing of the pay scale for these officers that are currently here, we need to convert them. We can't just convert them at a LPO 3 is going to be a 3-year officer. Like I showed you earlier, we'll have pay losses and that will never get accepted by our membership. And so we figure that this is a fair way to convert them. And by posting it this way, I think it would help Biff work with Jody and determine, okay, we have this many LPO 3s. If we brought them in at this rate, you'll have a better idea of what that will actually cost. So that's kind of our position.
So I do want to just address the LPO on the previous city proposal. So it was not our intention to necessarily just crosswalk lateral officers into step C. So when we were costing it out, we were looking at the step that would have provided at least some sort of increase for the officer. And we are interested in moving towards a time and grade as opposed to length of service with the department to help sort of lateral officers understand at what point they would move through each of these steps. So it was not the city's intention to have lateral officers take a pay decrease.
Yeah, no, I understand that that was not the intention. I just think that there's confusion related to these 3 crazy pay scales, and it's really hard to work through. And so much hard to work through that when people come to work for us that are laterals, they're being told one thing, but contractually it's something else, and it's very confusing. It's very confusing. I mean, we just spoke to members that came in here as LPO 10s 2 years ago. They thought they were going to get a pay raise in January, and that's not how the contract reads. And so we understand that it's very confusing. I didn't think you were trying to cut pay from our guys. I'm not trying to put that intention on you, but that's the problems that we have. And so we absolutely have to fix them, and we're determined to fix them. So going forward, we don't have to deal with this anymore. And it's just dealing with the economic costs and wage compensations. So I guess I'm kind of confused a little bit when you say time and grade or years of service, because the way the proposal was originally made by Deputy Chief Brooks was step A is 1 year, step 2, you go to 2, step B, you go to 2 years, 3, et cetera, et cetera. So maybe I'm a little confused because that is based on years of service. And I know that the chief and the department does not necessarily agree with paying people because they've worked here for a long time. I think that that level of experience, if they're provided with good supervisors and good leadership, and they are going to be forced to be good employees, for lack of a better term, that experience does matter. And that experience shows for our citizens. So I'm kind of confused a little bit, I guess.
Yep. So I think when we first presented the proposal, we had created the crosswalk against the NPO schedule. And so that would assume it was a brand new police officer. So it is a little bit easier to talk about like the service with the department. Under the previous proposal, the intention was that the chief would still have some discretion at choosing what step a lateral officer came in at. So it could be step D or whatever the case might be. And that's where the time and grade comes into play. So I think when it was first presented, because we wanted to show the potential wage increase for officers, it was compared to the NPO schedule, which would have been a brand new police officer, not a lateral.
Understandable. So to give you an example, we had an officer who came from Portland Police Department as a lateral, was a 10-year officer, got brought in at LPO 10 pay. We had an officer who had 12 years of experience, was a detective at Portland Police Department and got brought in at LPO 3 pay. So these are the problems that we see. And that's hard for us to defend. And I guess I don't understand how that doesn't seem biased. And so, when you have a guy from New York who's got 10 years of experience and you bring him in from New York Police Department and you bring him in at a 3-year pay grade, I don't understand how a guy from California who has 8 years gets brought in at 10-year pay and he gets brought in at 3-year pay. And so these are the frustrations that we deal with from our membership and that we are trying to fix. And I'm not claiming that there's ill intention. But anytime you have subjective decisions being made, you're going to have biases. And we want to limit those biases.
So I'm not exactly sure who you're talking about. I think these people were brought in before me, but it's my understanding, just based on prior conversations, that one of the reasons that, utilizing the example you used, someone came in, they were brought in at LPO 10, and then someone else later came in at LPO 3, was because the chief received complaints from the union that someone was brought in at that step. And at that point, they were saying that it required people in the future to be brought in at that lower pay step, that there was a complaint that lateral officers were being brought in at that higher pay step. Am I misinterpreting that?
A little bit. I think you're kind of mischaracterizing a little bit. The union told the chief that if he brought in people at super high pay rates, that he was going to undermine some morale because other guys who have similar experiences were not compensated for it. At the same time, we told the membership, look, cost of living have increased. Previous administrator brought people in at a different rate. We're not blaming the current chief for what he decided to do, but now all of a sudden we've turned tail on that. And I don't know how you don't deal with that in the future, having that kind of system where another chief comes in, or maybe this chief is like, wow, that's a lot of experience. We're going to pay you this. And then that causes some commotion and waves because it's subjective and because it can be looked as biased. And so if we have a system where it's standardized, it takes that away. And I don't necessarily know exactly what that is, but I know it needs to be competitive with Meridian. And I know that it needs to be fair and apply the least amount of bias possible.
No, understood that. And I believe you're kind of getting what I was saying, that someone was brought in and then the union came and complained and said, if you keep bringing people in at this pay rate, you're going to reduce morale. And then people were brought in at the lower pay scale. I also believe that there was discussion about a formula, because if I understand what I heard you say earlier, is that you feel that anybody at any police department with the same number of years on should be paid equally if they are to come here. And then when I look at agencies, and I'll just use Portland because you brought it up, versus a small agency in Idaho that maybe only had 10 officers, I'm not sure that the same number of years in those two agencies would equate to the same pay. So there was that discussion, and I think the union was open to providing some sort of formula that allowed the chief to have parameters to work within, and then utilize that to bring in people at a pay rate commensurate with their true level of experience, not just the years of service they have on at a particular agency.
So how are you going to quantify that, chief? How are you going to quantify years of experience?
I don't think you should quantify years of experience in and of itself. So I think we're talking about people. We're talking about human beings. We're talking about people with different careers. So I'm not a fan of just saying X equals X. You look at, and that's where the discretion for the chief comes in, where you take a look at a person and see what their life experience was, what their education is, what their professional experience was, how many years they worked at different agencies. I mean, you take a look at the total package and then determine what you believe they could be brought in at.
Do we do that for new officers?
No.
So,
But that's also, but we're also not talking about, so an entry level can come in and they're going to be brought in at the basic pay rate for an entry level person. A lateral police officer, if you are going to attract laterals like you're talking about, there needs to be some level of incentive to take the experience, recognizing that these people are going to take less time to train and they're going to bring professional experiences to the table.
So I think the issue we run into, Chief, is, and I'll use Chief Lee as an example. He came from Portland, so he's not familiar with Idaho agencies, how Idaho agencies are set up. So if you're going by agency size, I lateraled here from Twin Falls Police Department. I did more in a year call load wise and exposure to calls in a year in Twin than you'll do in 5 in Boise at that time. That was 20 years ago. It may be changed now. So I think if you say, we're just going to go by agency size, and you have an administration that's not familiar with Idaho's agencies and what the call loads are in different places in the state, you're going to end up shorting. And now we're losing those recruits from Twin Falls PD, Pocatello PD
Sure.
that are very busy. And to Denny's point, Garden City PD, that's been a very good recruiting in the past location for us. They get really good experience in a very short period of time. And so we can recruit those officers. But I think what's problematic is when we have the chief, and no offense to you or the chief, but a chief and a deputy chief that have come from other states that aren't familiar with Idaho and what the exposure is here. And I would even argue, I'll be honest, I'm an Idaho kid, so I look at things very much through the Idaho lens, but even small agencies, Elmore County Sheriff's Office, you have a deputy that works 2 hours is his closest backup up in Pine and Featherville. So his ability to communicate, talk to people, relate with the community is far superior to an officer from Portland or Seattle or LA or any of those types of places. And so I think it's really hard to quantify unobjectively what your experience is. So our intent is this levels the playing field. It gives credit to those guys coming from agencies that maybe don't get the credit they deserve. And so I think we're making it very easy here, and it's lessening and reducing the amount that we then have to explain to members why a guy that came from Portland that maybe has never done a homicide investigation is worth more than a guy that came from Jerome County who's investigated 3 homicides from receiving the call to putting the guy in jail. So I think this just really cleans that up and makes it so that we're giving credit at the most equitable rate we could.
Okay. And just so that I can be clear, one, I don't think the chief has made any decision in a bubble without conferring with other people, without doing his research to determine what an agency level of experience is. And then 2, I also want to make sure that at no point did we ever say that a decision was going to be made based solely on the size of the agency.
I just have a quick question. Is the union's position that this is a different issue for police versus any other department or any other director?
Well, I think that police is a unique deal. I mean, when I say that, I mean, if I work in finance, probably use the same Questica software wherever I'm at. I'm using current trends. Experience to experience, it's probably more equal. In law enforcement, there's so many factors to it. The community engagement. We currently provide a lot of service to our citizens that other organizations around the country would not even go to or not even handle. They would say, this is a civil problem, you figure it out. We are willing to send our officers and deal with any kind of help we can to our citizens. And so I think it's a little unique in that regard. But I think that once again, we need to come up with a system that is competitive with other local agencies. So we're not losing those. This conversion has to do with the members working here. I do think that the lateral pay that we recommended on our first proposal, which is the exact same as Meridian Police Departments, does have some discretion for the chief. But, when we get a new chief, he may be completely unfair and pay everybody out of the lowest pay rate just to save money, right? And so we have to look beyond our current administration. We're trying to protect our members to down the road memberships or management personnel. So we need to come up with a system. We are open to systems. We proposed originally the 50% credit, given some discretion with some things. We provided the Meridian one. But we have to fix this problem somehow. So we're open to ideas, but it's a problem that needs to be fixed if we're going to come to a contract resolution.
Well, and I think it's appropriate to note as well, kind of as far as other departments in the city, obviously we're not familiar with their work and what they do, but so it'd be unfair for us to really say whether it's the same or not. But if we look at national best practice, when you look at other agencies across the country, there's not really discretion on the majority of the agencies that we've found. The chief has to bring people in. It's a fixed pay scale. If you look at recruiting ads, it's a fixed pay scale. This is what you come in at with this level of experience. So we're just trying to kind of match up what is some national best practice as well from what we're seeing.
Can I ask one question not related to laterals? Sorry to change the topic.
Next question. Next question.
The body camera pay, I don't have any police contracts where officers get paid extra for body cameras, for wearing body cameras. What's the rationale for that?
Well, it's a working condition, and I think it's well established that it's a working condition. But it's an inconvenience. We understand the necessity and the importance of it. And so we feel like officers should be compensated for those inconveniences. Like I said, we've discussed this before. We changed the percentage, but we feel like because it's a working condition, we should be incentivized for it.
Well, and Adam, I think it's fair to point out on the cameras as well, it's a little bit of a different tool than anything else we carry, in the sense that there's ability to get into somebody's very personal life. And the department has even admitted there's been issues with cameras being automatically activated in locker rooms, in bathrooms, things like that, because of the technology that's there. Our current body cameras, there's technology there. The city has not purchased it yet, but there is technology there for supervisors to just remote activate that body camera. So I could be on the phone having a private conversation with my spouse, a medical conversation, for example, and that camera could get turned on and record that conversation. So we feel like it's more than just a typical working condition. It actually has the potential to get into somebody's very personal and private life as well. So that's, I think, part of why we're looking at that.
And then I just want to make sure I'm clear. Those inadvertent activations in the locker room, that's due to human error for not putting it in a snooze mode, which is what we require, or what we ask people to do when they're in those situations in which the camera doesn't need to be activated. There is a manual way which individual officers can put the camera on snooze, which would avoid that inadvertent activation. Is that correct?
So in theory, yes, but I do believe we've had some activations outside of that as well. So, I mean, it's technology, right? So it's a piece of equipment, and we're relying on computers and that equipment to function properly. So when it doesn't, then no, it would not.
Yeah, anything technology can take a turn, or anything mechanical can take a turn. There's human error, but nobody's going to be perfect. And so, especially during a busy day, a hectic day, when you're hustling around. And so those issues do come up, and they have the potential for coming up, as well as, inadvertently having it on and things come about, conversations with people, et cetera. So there is a bit of an inconvenience to it. It has changed to some degree the way we have to operate. Because we have to focus on getting that turned on during a hot call, which diverts my attention from potential risky things. So when I'm driving down the road, I got to try to do this before I get on scene of an emergency call or a life-threatening call. So there's a lot to it. We discussed this already once. I think it's a big inconvenience. It's a necessity in law enforcement today. I think it's a good thing, but it's also an inconvenience. I mean, wearing a body armor is necessity. It's an inconvenience, right? And so it's just one of those things that we're requesting to be compensated for.
And I might have missed this earlier. I know Adam had talked about it's not his, he hasn't seen it previously. Do you know agencies that currently pay incentive pay for officers wearing body cameras?
I know agencies that negotiated in their contract. I'm not sure about the pay, but as far as the working conditions of it, when it has to be activated, who can activate it, et cetera.
No, I understand that. I'm curious. Do you know any other agency that pays an incentive pay for officers wearing body cameras?
We didn't do the research on that. So it's not, like I said, it's a working condition. We proposed some restrictions on those working conditions, which were denied by you guys. And so we abandoned those protections for our members. And so we feel that it's relevant to ask for pay instead. So I think that concludes our presentations related to counter wage proposals and other information for today.
I think it would be helpful, Biff, if you would go over, I know there were some questions from the union in the beginning of the meeting, and then the city wanted the opportunity to respond to some of this information just to make sure we have it all. Do you have notes from earlier with questions from the union?
Yeah, so let me repeat some of the questions that I heard. So question number one was how many employees were factored into the wage calculations? And particularly what classification of employees, for example, police officer, sergeant, lieutenant, et cetera.
Correct.
I also heard a question. You'd like a detailed list of which positions qualified for the different incentive pays?
Correct.
And those are the two primary questions I've got. Did I miss any? Oh, would you like the vacancy rate factor as well?
Yeah, I think
What that is?
vacancy
Okay.
rate.
We can provide that.
In addition to that, the city would like the opportunity to look at the city's investment in the department as it relates to the growth of the budget overall. We'll take a look at those pie charts and make sure at least I have an understanding of what revenue those are based on. And I'm looking to see if there was anything else. Does anyone have any follow-up questions or need for information before we take a break? Are you proposing to break for the day?
Yeah, we have nothing further. If the city does, we're willing to stick, but otherwise.
The city is fast, but not that fast. Any other questions or clarifications on either side before we end for the day? Would we like to take this opportunity to schedule the next meeting? I do not believe we have one on the books unless I'm mistaken.
Yeah, that would be fine.
Okay.
Actually, I'm showing the 14th. I received an invite for the 14th, if that's enough time.
You're correct. I see that.
Oh, you're not.
Does it not work now?
It doesn't sound like it for.
Yeah, the 14th does not work.
Okay. Can we have that hold removed? Thanks. Assume that was for police. If it was for fire, we just need that clarified. I could make, if I needed to, the morning of the 15th work.
The morning works on our side.
That never happens. That's fantastic. We'll go ahead and hold the time from 9 to 12. I think that should work. Yeah. With that, any other business before we wrap up? All right. Thank you, everybody.